Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you into a world that feels both distant and strangely familiar. Picture a small Victorian village in the grip of winter. Not the postcard kind of winter, with frosted windows and cheerful carols, but the kind where hunger gnaws at the belly, where roofs strain beneath mountains of snow, and where survival itself hangs on the thinnest thread. The Victorian era stretched across the 19th century, a time of railroads, industry, and empire, but also a time when much of rural England and its surrounding lands still lived by rhythms older than the machines that were reshaping the cities. For villagers, winter was not a season to be admired from indoors. It was an enemy they fought every year, and some years, the battle was brutal enough to claim lives. Now, let's be clear. When we talk about the worst winters, we're talking about moments when snow blocked roads for weeks, when livestock perished in frozen barns, and when even the strongest men came home with frostbitten fingers after chopping wood. The cold was relentless, the food supplies finite, and the community's strength measured not in wealth, but in cooperation and grit. Imagine a village lane in January. The cottages are stone-built, their roofs pitched steep to let the snow slide off. Yet heavy drifts still cling stubbornly, piling against the doors and windows until they resemble buried caves. Smoke curls from chimneys, thin and blue, struggling upward into a sky the color of iron. Every breath freezes on the air. Every step crunches on hard-packed snow that refuses to melt. And inside those cottages, families are huddled close, not for cheer, but because body heat itself was a resource. The hearth was everything. Without it, winter was death. Families prepared for months in advance, stacking cords of wood in tidy piles, gathering peat from the bogs, drying it in blocks, and rationing every piece like treasure. A single log meant another night of warmth, another chance for children to sleep without shivering until dawn. Fires were banked carefully at night, smoldering under ash, so that a single ember could spark the next day's flame. Losing a fire in the dead of winter was disastrous. It meant scrambling for kindling, burning scraps of old furniture, or begging warmth from a neighbor. Food was equally precious. Villagers relied on autumn harvests, on salted meats, dried beans, stored apples, and root vegetables packed in straw-lined crates beneath floorboards or in root cellars. Flour was stretched thinner each week, bread loaves cut smaller, and broth watered down until it was little more than steam and hope. Mothers often went without, pushing bowls toward their children, pretending they had already eaten. Fathers returned from barns or woods with empty stomachs, their strength carried only by willpower and duty. Yet even in this scarcity, tradition demanded one thing: sharing. No Victorian village survived winter on isolation alone. Neighbors carried loaves across thresholds, left logs at doorsteps, and slipped jars of broth to the sick. It wasn't charity, it was insurance. Because the moment you stopped caring for others was the moment the village itself weakened. And once the village failed, everyone failed. The worst winters often brought storms so fierce they erased the world outside. Lanes vanished beneath mountains of snow. Barn doors froze shut. Windows rattled under winds that shrieked like voices. Children pressed against their mothers, whispering questions. When will it end? And the answer was always the same. Soon, my love. Soon. But everyone knew soon could mean days, even weeks. Men dug paths through drifts taller than themselves, carving narrow tunnels that connected cottages like veins through a buried body. Lanterns bobbed in the blizzard, faint sparks of gold against the vast white. They dug to free the barns, to keep animals alive, because a dead sheep was not only wool lost, but warmth lost. A cow that stopped giving milk meant hungry children. Horses, those broad-shouldered partners of the fields, stood restless in their stalls, steam curling from their nostrils as farmers brushed frost from their coats and whispered promises of spring. And then there were the false thaws. How cruel they were. After weeks of bitter cold, a warm breeze might sweep through, melting the snow just enough to raise hope. Icicles dripped, rivulets ran, and villagers lifted their faces as if to greet salvation. But by morning, the water froze again, harder than before. Paths became sheets of ice, treacherous and slick. Spirits fell harder than the frost. People learned not to trust the first signs of change. Hope had to be measured carefully, like flour in a dwindling sack. Hunger deepened as the weeks dragged on. The hungry month, they called it February, when supplies were at their lowest and the cold showed no sign of release. Broths were little more than bones simmered to exhaustion. Bread was baked with acorn flour or barley husks, filling the belly but offering no strength. Children grew thin, their laughter subdued, while elders quietly asked for less, insisting the young must eat. Some families buried their pride and knocked on the healer's door, where dried herbs hung from the rafters and jars of syrups and roots waited to soothe coughs, fevers, and despair. Yet even amid this grimness, there was beauty. Lanterns glowing against snowbound lanes, children's laughter echoing off frozen ponds as they tried to skate with scraps of wood tied to their boots. Fiddles playing by the fire when the wind howled too loud to sleep. Candles guttering in windows, fragile flames that seemed to push back the very darkness. These were not luxuries, they were survival in another form. Proof that winter could freeze fields and choke rivers, but it could not extinguish the human spirit. And when the thaw finally came, when the snow groaned and cracked and rivers began to run again, the relief was almost unbearable. Mothers pressed their children's hands to the earth, letting them feel the damp soil. Fathers bent low to scatter seeds in dark, rich furrows, each grain a prayer whispered into the thawing ground. Elders, weary but smiling, reminded the young that every winter ends, no matter how fierce. The land always returns, and so do the people. So what did survival mean in those worst Victorian winters? It wasn't just bread or wood or blankets. It was patience. It was resourcefulness. It was compassion, shared across doorways. It was respect for the land and gratitude for every sunrise. The villagers knew winter would always return, but so would spring. And in that balance lay the story of endurance. If the hearth was the heart of survival, then daily labor was its pulse. Every member of the household, no matter how young or old, had a part to play in holding back the grip of winter. In a Victorian village, work didn't stop just because the snow fell. In fact, the colder it got, the more urgent every task became. From dawn, long before the weak sun rose over the hills, mothers stirred the ashes, poking carefully until sparks leapt and flames caught. They were the guardians of warmth. Without their steady hands, homes would remain dark and cold, their families vulnerable before the day had even begun. Pots of porridge bubbled on the fire, thickened with oats or barley, sometimes sweetened with a spoon of honey if luck had been kind that year. It wasn't much, but it gave strength enough to face another day. Women carried the invisible weight of winter. They rationed flour with a mathematician's precision, stretching a single loaf across 3 meals. They patched clothes until fabric became more thread than cloth, and when boots cracked, they stuffed them with straw to give them one more week of life. Hands never rested. Sewing, stirring, washing, soothing, every action was survival. And yet, they carried it with quiet dignity, often softening hardship with small graces. A scarf embroidered with flowers, a lullaby sung above the howling wind, a ribbon tied into a daughter's hair, even when water for washing was scarce. These little gestures mattered more than most would admit, for they reminded the family that life held beauty, even in bleakness. Fathers, brothers, and sons carried the visible weight. With axes over their shoulders, they trudged through snowdrifts up to their knees, seeking firewood. The woods, already dangerous in summer, became treacherous labyrinths in winter. Roots hidden beneath snow tripped the unwary, and paths vanished into endless whiteness. Men swung axes into frozen trunks, each strike ringing sharp and hollow through the silent forest. Fingers numbed quickly, breath steamed heavy, and yet they worked until their shoulders burned. Every log hauled home was more than fuel. It was proof that their families would see another night through. Tending livestock was relentless. Barn doors had to be dug free of snow each morning, hinges creaking under frost. Water troughs froze into solid blocks of ice, broken only by repeated blows. Men carried buckets heavy with icy water, their hands raw despite woolen gloves. Hay was scattered across stalls, precious stores dwindling each day. Sheep huddled together, their wool damp from breath, while cows chewed slowly on what little fodder remained. Horses stamped restlessly, their great bodies steaming in the chill air. These animals were not luxuries, they were survival incarnate, offering milk, wool, strength, and meat if desperation demanded it. To keep them alive was to keep the village alive. Children, though small, were not spared from duty. They gathered twigs and kindling, their arms laden with branches brittle from frost. They carried water in smaller pails, their breath puffing white in the air. They checked chickens in the dim light of coops, sometimes rewarded with a precious egg, sometimes not. And when tasks were done, they made games of what they had. A broken spoon became a soldier, a scrap of cloth a doll, and their laughter, even when faint, was a salve for weary parents. The elderly carried a different kind of burden. Age slowed their steps and stiffened their joints, but their value was measured in wisdom. By the hearth, they told stories of winters past, of storms so fierce entire cottages were buried, of hunger so sharp that bark was boiled into broth. These tales weren't told to frighten, but to remind the young that hardship was a cycle, and cycles always turned. This too shall pass, they would say, gazing into the flames. Their presence was living proof that survival was possible, and their memories were maps to endurance. But winter tested even the strongest. Frostbite stalked the unwary. Fingers blackened when gloves grew wet. Toes numbed until boots offered no protection. Mothers rubbed children's hands briskly by the fire, whispering reassurances even as fear flickered in their eyes. Coughs rattled through cottages, deep, and lingering. Fevers burned hot against the cold air. The village healer became a lifeline. Her cottage smelled of dried herbs, lavender, thyme, rosemary, and her shelves brimmed with jars of roots and berries. Honey mixed with garlic for sore throats, willow bark tea for aches, elderflower for fevers. She was no miracle worker, but in an age before modern medicine, her care gave hope. Church bells marked time. In a world where days blurred into endless gray, their tolls cut through the silence, calling villagers together. On Sundays, they trudged through narrow snow-packed lanes, lanterns swinging, voices low. Inside the church, candles glowed against stone walls. Hymns rose in weary unison, and faith was renewed, not only in God, but in one another. The bells also signaled other moments, urgent peals when storms threatened, solemn tolls when death visited, bright chimes when the child was born. They were the voice of the community, speaking across snow and frost, reminding everyone they were not alone. Isolation was winter's cruelest trick. Storms could trap families inside for days, even weeks. Neighbors vanished behind walls of snow, their lives marked only by thin trails of smoke rising into the sky. In those days, lanterns became lifelines. Their golden glow drifted across the lanes like wandering stars. To see one bobbing through the storm was to feel less alone. Men carried them to neighbors' doors, leaving food, herbs, or news with a quiet knock. Children pressed their faces to frosted windows, comforted by those small orbs of light that proved community still pulsed beneath the snow. And yet, amidst all this toil and worry, villagers found ways to carve out moments of joy. Music was a refuge. Fiddles and pipes filled cottages with melody, voices lifted in song, boots tapped on wooden floors, children banged pots, laughed in circles, and mimicked the howling wind outside. Shadows cast by candlelight became characters in games, wolves and heroes, kings and monsters. Even the harshest winter couldn't silence joy. It only made it more precious. So much of Victorian winter survival was about balance, between hunger and sharing, between fear and faith, between exhaustion and play. Every day tested patience, yet every day proved endurance. And while bodies grew thinner and woodpiles shorter, the community itself grew stronger. Because winter was never just a season to them, it was a teacher, one that carved lessons into bone and memory. And when the thaw finally came, when the first shoots of green pierced the earth and lambs cried in the straw, the villagers carried more than relief. They carried patience learned in hunger, resourcefulness honed in scarcity, compassion tested by hardship, reverence for the cycles of nature, and gratitude deeper than words. That was the gift of the worst winters, not just survival, but wisdom. Wisdom passed from elders to children, from one generation to the next, like a torch that never went out. If the daily grind of survival was the backbone of winter, then traditions and rituals were its soul. Without them, the season would have been nothing but endless hunger and cold. But the Victorians, even in the smallest villages, found ways to mark time, to remind themselves that life was not only about enduring, but about belonging to something larger. One of the most cherished traditions was the midwinter feast. Now, don't imagine overflowing tables groaning under roasts and puddings like you'd find in wealthy homes or in Dickens stories. For most villagers, a feast in the dead of winter looked modest, sometimes downright meager by modern standards. but in context it was everything. Families pooled what little they could spare: half a loaf, a jug of ale, a few wrinkled apples, a clutch of eggs, or, if luck had been kind, a rabbit or bird snared in the fields. When laid together on the long tables of the church hall, these small contributions transformed scarcity into abundance. The hall itself was dressed with care. Pine boughs were brought in from the woods, their sharp resin scent filling the air. Holly with bright berries adorned windows, its deep green leaves a defiance against the white outside. Children plaited garlands with clumsy fingers, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. When candles were lit, dozens of flames flickering against the gloom, the room felt like a sanctuary, not just of faith, but of joy. At the feast, steaming bowls of broth passed from hand to hand. Bread was torn and dipped, roots roasted until their sweetness filled the air, and mugs of ale lifted in cheer. The food may have been plain, but it tasted like hope itself. And when the fiddler lifted his bow, when feet stamped in rhythm, the hardship of winter loosened its hold. For one night, people remembered laughter, remembered music, remembered that hunger could not silence their spirits. Markets, too, returned with cautious joy as soon as the snow loosened its grip. Imagine the square, cleared of drifts, muddy with thaw, stalls dragged out and propped on cobblestones. The first goods were humble eggs from hens eager in the new light, milk foaming fresh from cows that had calved, herbs grown carefully in windowsills, and maybe a wheel of cheese guarded through the hungry months. But these stalls meant more than trade. They meant connection. They meant the return of chatter, of neighbors meeting neighbors, of voices rising above the silence that had blanketed the world for so long. Musicians who had hidden their fiddles during the storms brought them out again, their strings creaking at first, then finding confidence as tunes filled the square. Children tugged at sleeves, begging for treats: an apple, a ribbon, a sweet nut. Parents smiled, not because they had plenty, but because they saw joy returning to their little ones' faces. Yet, in the midst of these moments of celebration, winter reminded them not to let down their guard. False thaws were cruel tricks of the season. A few days of dripping eaves, softened snow, even a patch of water gleaming dark against the ice could stir hope too early. Villagers would whisper, "Perhaps spring is near," only to wake the next morning to biting wind and frozen ground harder than before. These false thaws pressed heavily on hearts. They were lessons in patience, reminders that the season yielded only when it was ready. And so, the villagers leaned on rituals not only to celebrate, but to endure disappointment. Elders told stories by the fire of winters when the thaw hadn't come until April, yet still the earth had given generously. Mothers pointed out snowdrops blooming bravely in corners of the yard, tiny white flowers that promised renewal. Fathers guided children's hands to plant seeds in pots indoors, showing them that even when the soil outside was locked in ice, life still stirred. The church bells marked these rhythms. They rang for births and deaths, for gatherings and storms, but in winter, their sound carried heavier weight. The bells were a heartbeat for the whole village, steady against the silence of snow. And when storms silenced them, when ropes froze stiff, the absence was keenly felt, as though time itself had faltered. When the bells finally rang again, their voices were sweeter than any hymn. And let's not forget the role of story itself. Winter was a season of tales. families huddled near the fire, children leaning close to grandparents as voices rose and fell in rhythm with the crackle of the logs. Some stories were warnings: wolves prowling near doors, spirits wandering the frozen woods, winters so fierce tunnels had to be dug to reach the barns. Others were tales of wonder lights dancing in the northern sky, flowers blooming through snow, angels guiding travelers through storms. To children, these were as thrilling as fairy tales. To adults, they were reminders stitched into memory that survival was always a balance of fear and faith. Music, story, feast, and market, these weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. They turned endurance into community. They wove hardship into memory rather than despair. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded every villager that while the winter was harsh, it could never strip them of their humanity. Because in the end, survival in Victorian winters was not just about food and fire. It was about keeping the heart alive through song, through ritual, through connection. And as long as those things endured, the people endured too. If food and firewood were the muscles that kept a Victorian village alive in the cruelest winters, then medicine, both real and imagined, was its fragile heartbeat. Because cold didn't just bring hunger, it brought sickness. And in the days before modern hospitals, before antibiotics, before vaccines, a simple cough could turn deadly, and a fever could sweep through cottages like wildfire. Every village relied on its healer. Sometimes she was a woman with knowledge handed down from her grandmother. Sometimes he was a farmer who had learned herbs by trial and error. These healers weren't physicians in the London sense. They didn't wear white coats or carry diplomas, but their wisdom often meant the difference between endurance and despair. Step inside their cottages, and you'd know at once you had entered another world. Dried bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, their brittle shapes rattling softly when the wind pushed at the door. The air was thick with scents: sharp thyme, sweet chamomile, biting garlic, earthy valerian root. On shelves stood jars of powders, syrups, and tinctures, each carefully labeled in spidery handwriting. A mortar and pestle, worn smooth from decades of use, rested on the table, ready to grind leaves into poultices or roots into bitter powders. Mothers brought feverish children, their cheeks flushed, their little lungs rattling with winter coughs. The healer would press a hand to their brow, listen to their breath, and mix honey with garlic to ease their throats. A farmer might come with cracked, bleeding hands from carrying water and splitting wood in the frost. For him, the healer made a salve of goose fat and herbs, thick and greasy, but soothing enough to let him grip his axe again. And when someone came with what villagers whispered of as the wasting sickness, a slow decline, no broth or blanket could cure, the healer offered teas of willow bark or elderflower, not as a cure, but as comfort. Sometimes comfort was all that could be given. Illness wasn't only about fevers. Frostbite and chilblains were constant threats. Children came in with toes pale as candle wax, fingers swollen and raw. The healer rubbed them with snow to stimulate circulation, then wrapped them in warm cloths, urging the family to keep a closer fire or rub the skin with vinegar and spirits. Did it always work? Not always, but it was knowledge passed down, and often that was enough. Some remedies walked the line between medicine and ritual. A woolen scarf dipped in vinegar, wrapped around a chest to draw out the sickness. A hot broth, salted just enough to sting the tongue, believed to restore strength. bread baked with garlic cloves pressed into the crust, eaten slowly by those with colds. Were these cures? Perhaps not in the scientific sense, but they brought comfort, and comfort mattered. And let's not overlook the role of prayer. Faith was woven into every remedy. A spoonful of elderberry syrup was given with a whispered blessing. A cloth dipped in honey water was pressed to lips while the mother murmured a psalm. The healer herself might light a candle beside the bed, not as a miracle, but as a reminder that hope still burned even when the body weakened. Fear of disease also shaped daily life. When coughs spread through the village, families kept children inside, bundled near the hearth. Windows shuddered against the biting wind. Neighbors left food at doorsteps instead of visiting their knock quick and their departure quicker. The church bells tolled not only for Sunday services but also for funerals, sometimes too many in a single winter. Each toll was a reminder of life's fragility, each silence afterward a heavy one. And yet, even in the face of illness, community carried people through. Families shared herbs when stores ran low. Neighbors checked on the elderly, leaving broth or firewood at their doors. If someone's supply of honey or garlic ran out, another cottage might share theirs, even at the cost of their own comfort. Because in the end, survival wasn't about one household enduring alone. It was about all enduring together. But sickness didn't have the final word. There were also moments of recovery. When a child's fever broke at dawn, their small body drenched in sweat, but their breathing finally steady. When a man who had been bedridden rose to eat bread by the fire. When the healer, weary but satisfied, walked home under a sky filled with stars, her lantern swaying, her steps slow but steady. These victories were celebrated not with feasts, but with gratitude, whispered prayers, and a bowl of warm stew. The healer's presence carried more than medicine. It carried reassurance. To see her lantern bobbing through the snow toward a cottage was to feel a weight lift. It meant someone cared. Someone knew what to do. Someone could ease the fear. And in the bleakest nights of Victorian winter, that reassurance was as vital as any cure. So while the hunger gnawed and the cold pressed in, it was illness that truly tested the village. Yet through herbs and honey, prayer and patience, through the steady hands of the healer and the quiet endurance of mothers and fathers, the villagers faced even that trial. And though not all were saved, enough were. Enough always were. Because the lesson of Victorian winters was this: survival wasn't about erasing hardship. It was about meeting it head on, with whatever knowledge, faith, and kindness you had to give. Hey guys, welcome back. We've talked about firewood, food, and even the remedies that helped Victorian villagers fight sickness in the worst of winters. But let's pause for a moment and ask something deeper. What happens to the human spirit when the world outside your door is locked in ice for months, when daylight lasts only a few short hours, and when every creak in the rafters sounds like the sky pressing down? The truth is, surviving a Victorian winter wasn't just about the body. It was about the mind, the heart, and the soul. Loneliness, fear, and despair were as dangerous as frostbite. And so the villagers built rituals, small acts of meaning that held them together when the nights seemed endless. Imagine the silence first. Outside, snow muffled every sound. Lanes that once echoed with wagons and voices were buried. The river, once full of chatter and laughter on market days, lay frozen and silent. Even the animals grew quieter. their bleats and lowing dulled by the thick air. Inside, you'd hear only the crackle of the fire, the shuffle of feet on creaking floorboards, or the hushed cough of someone under blankets. That silence was heavy, too heavy. And so villagers fought it with sound. Music, for example, was a lifeline. A fiddle pulled from its worn case by firelight, a penny whistle carved by hand, a drum made from an upturned bucket or barrel. Even simple clapping and stamping feet became songs when shared. These weren't grand concerts, they were survival. A reminder that life still pulsed even when the world outside seemed dead. Storytelling carried equal weight. When the wind howled outside and shadows danced across the walls, families huddled closer, and the elders began to speak. Their voices were slow, steady, drawing children into tales of winters long past, of storms fiercer than this one, of neighbors who shared their last loaf, of miracles when hope seemed lost. Did every story hold strict truth? Maybe not. But truth wasn't the point. The point was connection. A rope thrown across the darkness, binding one generation to the next. And then there were rituals of light. Candles weren't wasted casually, yet every family saved at least one for special evenings when spirits sagged. They'd gather around that single flame, watching its glow soften the drawn lines of hunger and fatigue, and for an hour the gloom lifted. Some families carved lanterns from turnips or clay, setting them on shelves as symbols that darkness could always be answered. In the church, the glow of many candles together created something extraordinary, a sea of flickering light that seemed to push back the weight of winter itself. Faith, of course, played a central role. Sunday services were more than religious duty. They were a chance to gather, to remind one another that endurance was possible. The toll of the church bell wasn't just a call to prayer, it was a call to hope, a reminder that the community still stood. Hymns sung in cold stone walls rose like warmth itself, weaving voices together until even the frailest felt lifted. But hope didn't come only from church. It came from small daily rituals too. Mothers braided their daughters' hair even when water was scarce, weaving beauty into hardship. Fathers taught boys how to whittle small toys from scraps of wood, giving their hands purpose beyond labor. Children invented games with shadows, with sticks, with pebbles, tiny acts of defiance against despair. Neighbors checked on one another through the snow, carrying lanterns between cottages, leaving food or kind words. Sometimes it was just a knock on the door, a nod, "We're still here." But in a world where loneliness could crush the spirit, that nod meant everything. The hardest nights were those when storms howled for days, when families felt cut off from the world, unsure if others had survived. In those times, villagers relied on imagination, not of escape, but of endurance. They'd carve tally marks on beams to track days. They'd recite proverbs about patience. They'd tell children, "Spring is already on its way, just sleeping under the snow." It wasn't science, but it was survival. And here's what's striking. These rituals didn't just keep people busy. They gave meaning. They reminded the villagers that they weren't powerless, that even in the face of nature's cruelty, they could answer with song, with prayer, with laughter, with stories, with kindness. Think about it. How many of us today, with central heating and bright electric light, could endure months of freezing silence, with only a candle, a fiddle, and the sound of our neighbor's footsteps in the snow to comfort us. That was the true strength of Victorian villagers. Not only their bodies, but their minds, hardened and softened at the same time by rituals of resilience. Because in the end, winter wasn't just endured, it was given meaning. And that meaning carried them, not just to spring, but to every winter after. The heart of winter was cruel, no question. But even in those endless nights of hunger and frost, villagers knew one truth that kept them going. People cannot live on bread and fire alone. They needed joy, laughter, and something to remind them that they were more than survivors scraping by in the snow. And so, amid hardship, they carved out moments of celebration, rituals that turned scarcity into feasts, silence into song, despair into fellowship. One of the most powerful traditions was the midwinter gathering. Families saved tiny stores of food for weeks, even months, setting aside what little they could spare. A jar of honey untouched since autumn, a wheel of cheese guarded carefully in the cellar, a handful of apples kept in straw. Hunters contributed a rabbit or bird if they were lucky. Farmers shared butter, milk, or a sliver of pork salted away. Every contribution, however small, became part of a communal feast. The church hall, or the largest cottage in the village, would transform into a sanctuary of warmth. Pine branches were cut from the forest and hung across beams, their scent filling the room with the sharp fragrance of life. Holly with red berries brightened the corners, a flash of color against the gray. Children made garlands from twigs, weaving them with laughter, their joy as valuable as the food itself. When the tables were set, there was no luxury by a noble's measure, but by the standard of winter it was abundance. Thick bread dipped into steaming broth, roots roasted until their edges browned, butter spread across slices that tasted like gold. Each plate carried not just food, but hope. Every bite, shared among neighbors, was proof that they were stronger together than alone. After supper came music. Fiddlers tuned their strings by firelight, their notes weaving through the hall until boots tapped and hands clapped in rhythm. Pipes carved from wood, drums beaten by palms, voices raised in song, these sounds filled the air with a kind of defiance. Winter could freeze the fields, but it could not silence the human need for joy. Dances broke out, slow and stumbling at first, then lively and bold. Couples twirled, children spun in circles, and even the weary elders smiled, tapping their feet to the beat. Stories were told, jokes shared, old songs passed down and sung again. For one night, hunger loosened its grip, and the weight of survival lifted. But these gatherings weren't just for pleasure. They were a declaration, a way of saying, we are more than what this winter would make of us. The midwinter feast became a yearly milestone, a promise that even at the season's darkest, light still lived among them. And it wasn't only feasts that carried this spirit. There were smaller rituals of celebration scattered through the cold months. Families baked special loaves on Sundays, even if they were thin and plain, just to break the monotony of daily porridge. Mothers braided ribbons into their daughters' hair on holidays. Fathers carved toys from scraps of wood, surprising children with little gifts when spirits sagged. The church played its role too. Bells rang not just for prayer, but for joy marking births, weddings, or the safe return of travel. Hymns lifted voices higher than hunger, higher than fear, echoing against stone walls, until they seemed to carry heaven itself into the village. Celebration also lived in the simplest acts. a neighbor leaving bread at another's door, a family sharing the last apple with a sick child, a circle of people gathered around a candle, telling stories while shadows danced across the walls. Each of these moments, however small, was a spark of resistance against despair. You see, the brilliance of these villagers was not in pretending winter wasn't harsh. It was in finding ways to claim joy anyway, to look the season straight in the eye and answer its cruelty with laughter, music, and fellowship. Because survival wasn't just about keeping the body alive. It was about keeping the spirit unbroken. And these midwinter celebrations, these rituals of joy, were what carried them through. They were the heartbeat of the village, steady and strong even when frost pressed against the door. So when we ask how Victorian villagers survived the worst winters, the answer is not only in firewood, food, and clothing. It is also in song, in dance, in shared meals and shared burdens. It is in the way they chose, again and again, to turn hardship into memory, and memory into story. And in those stories, they found their greatest strength of all. If there's one thing Victorians understood better than most of us today, it was that survival in the dead of winter wasn't just about what people did for each other. It was also about their relationship with the natural world around them. Animals, rivers, and forests weren't just scenery. They were teachers, companions, and sometimes fierce enemies. Learning to read their signs often made the difference between life and death. Take the animals, for instance. Horses, once proud and powerful in the fields, became subdued under the weight of cold. Their breath rose in thick plumes, their coats shaggy with winter hair. Villagers would walk through the stables at dawn, laying a hand on each flank, murmuring softly as they brushed frost from manes and tails. It wasn't just care, it was connection. People believed animals understood suffering as well as they did, and that their patience gave hope for spring. Sheep, huddled together in barns, were a constant chorus of low bleats. Farmers pressed their hands into the wool, searching for warmth, knowing each fleece promised both survival now and prosperity later. Losing even one to the cold was like losing a thread in the fabric of the whole community. Cows, too, tested endurance. Their milk thinned in the lean months, but every bucket drawn was received like a blessing. Even chickens, silent in their coops, guarded their rare eggs like treasures. And it wasn't just livestock. Wild animals left their mark on village life as well. Foxes crept close to barns, eyes glinting in lantern light, drawn by the scent of scraps. Birds crowded the hedgerows, wings fluttering wildly over a handful of seeds. Even the smallest creatures, sparrows, robins, carried weight. Their return, their songs, their survival, gave villagers reassurance that life itself had not surrendered to the frost. To feed a bird in those months wasn't just kindness, it was a prayer. Then there was the river. All summer it ran clear, feeding fields and filling troughs. But when winter gripped it in silence, the frozen surface became both lifeline and danger. Villagers cut holes through the ice to draw water, the edges freezing back as quickly as they broke them. They hauled buckets up, heavy and cold, grateful for every drop, and yet the river could betray. Ice shifted with groans like thunder, opening cracks without warning. Stories spread of men swallowed whole, lanterns vanishing into black water. To walk across the river was to walk across the back of a sleeping giant. You moved carefully, reverently, never forgetting its power. and of course, the forest. Ah, the forest was both friend and foe. In summer, it was alive with green and song. In winter, it became a cathedral of silence. Branches bowed under the weight of snow, paths erased in a single storm. Still, the forest gave what it could: fallen branches for kindling, small game for the pot, pine boughs to bring color into cottages. But it also tested courage. Lose your way in its whiteness, and you might never return. Villagers told stories of spirits moving among the trees, flickers of shadow glimpsed at the edge of sight. Whether truth or fear, the tales reminded everyone to tread carefully. But here's the thing: the Victorians respected the natural world deeply. They didn't see themselves as separate from it, but bound to it, woven into its cycles of hardship and renewal. Animals weren't just beasts of burden, they were partners in endurance. Rivers weren't just water, they were living forces that could give or take. Forests weren't just resources, they were ancient guardians demanding humility. And that respect shaped survival. Villagers learned to read the weather in the flight of birds, the thickness of animal coats, the way ice cracked beneath their boots. They knew when storms were coming by the way the forest hushed, when frost would be sharpest by how the river steamed at dusk. Knowledge wasn't written in books, it was lived, passed down through eyes, ears, and calloused hands. So when we talk about how Victorians endured the worst winters, we're not just talking about human resilience. We're talking about a partnership with the land itself. A balance of taking and giving, of caution and trust. And in that partnership, they found strength no storm could be to erase. Because nature in winter was both a mirror and a mentor. It showed them their own fragility, yes, but it also reminded them of their own endurance, the quiet persistence that carried sheep through snow, rivers through ice, forests through silence. The same persistence that carried the villagers themselves through the cold, one day at a time. Faith. For Victorian villagers, it wasn't some grand cathedral sermon or gilded ritual reserved for elites. It was survival. It was the invisible thread woven through the long nights, the hunger, the storms that buried lanes higher than rooftops. Without it, winter could have swallowed them whole. Every village had its church, often perched on a rise or at the center of the square, its steeple pointing like a finger through the frost-heavy sky. In the depth of winter, when winds howled and shutters groaned, the toll of the church bell was more than sound, it was lifeblood. A single strike might announce death, its slow, solemn rhythm carrying grief across the drifts. Another pattern meant birth, a fragile triumph against the cold. Sometimes, the bells rang to call the villagers together when storms threatened roofs or when illness moved from cottage to cottage. Each peal was a language understood without words. On Sundays, despite snowdrifts that swallowed paths, families trudged slowly, lanterns swinging, boots crunching through ice, shoulders bent under cloaks heavy with frost. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, damp wool, and tallow smoke. Candles flickered against stone walls, small halos pushing back shadows. People sang hymns, not just for God, but for each other. Their voices rose, weary but strong, weaving together like threads in a quilt, creating warmth no fire could match. Faith, though, wasn't confined to pews. It was in the whispered prayers of mothers as they ladled broth into bowls, asking that each spoonful give strength. It was in the rough hands of fathers crossing themselves before stepping into storms, hoping to return alive. It was in the murmured blessings over newborn lambs, over seed sacks, over the last loaf pulled from the oven. Every act of care carried a prayer stitched silently into it. And yet, alongside faith, there was superstition, the kind of folklore that filled the gaps where reason or science faltered. Victorians lived in a world where medicine was uncertain, where storms defied prediction, where hunger gnawed without mercy. Superstition gave order to the chaos. Some believed the howling wind carried voices of the dead warnings perhaps, or restless spirits demanding respect. Children were told never to whistle at night, lest they call the storm closer. A raven perched on a rooftop was a sign of illness. A ring around the moon meant snow before dawn. To us, these may sound like stories, but in a time when survival balanced on a knife's edge, they were anchors. Charms hung above doors, sprigs of holly, bits of iron, carved symbols thought to ward off illness or bad fortune. Women stitched protective patterns into children's scarves, not just decoration, but talismans. Some households kept a candle burning through the night, believing its flame kept sickness at bay. Even the healer, with her jars of herbs and roots, leaned on rituals as much as remedies. She whispered chants while grinding bark, traced crosses in the air while steeping teas. Whether medicine or magic, it gave people something to cling to. But perhaps the most powerful ritual was storytelling. When nights stretched too long and storms screamed outside, elders drew children close to the fire and told tales. Stories of winters past when families survived by digging tunnels through snow taller than men. Stories of neighbors who shared their last loaf, of wolves kept at bay, of springs that came late but came nonetheless. These weren't fairy tales, they were survival manuals disguised as legend. They carried both warning and comfort, teaching endurance without the calm need for lectures. And there was music, always music. In cottages lit by a single candle, fiddles scraped out slow hymns, pipes breathed soft tunes, voices hummed lullabies. Sometimes families clapped and stomped, turning fear into rhythm. Sometimes they sang low, almost whispering, to soothe restless children or grieving hearts. Song became prayer, and prayer became survival. Faith, superstition, ritual, these were not luxuries. They were the architecture of resilience. When bread ran thin and wood piles dwindled, they gave villagers something no storm could steal, meaning, a reason to rise each morning, to shovel snow, to share crumbs, to hold on for another day. Because the truth is, winter was not just a battle of flesh against frost. It was a battle of spirit. And the villagers knew that while fires warmed hands and broth filled bellies, it was belief, sometimes humble, sometimes strange, that kept the soul alive until the first thaw. Illness was winter's shadow. For Victorian villagers, the cold season was not just about hunger or frost. It was about fevers that rose suddenly in the night, coughs that rattled through cottages, and infections that turned from mild to deadly before anyone could act. With every breath visible in the air, sickness seemed to drift on the very frost itself. Think of it. One child starts with a cough. By the end of the week, half the cottages echo with the same hollow sound. In a world without antibiotics, without reliable doctors in every village, sickness could become as dangerous as the fiercest blizzard. That's where the village healer came in. She wasn't a physician in a polished London office. She was often an older woman, her hands wrinkled, her shelves lined with jars of herbs, roots, and dried berries. Her knowledge came not from textbooks, but from generations before her, from grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had learned what the earth offered and how it could be coaxed into cure. Honey was her ally, thick and golden, stirred into hot water to ease sore throats. Garlic was hung in bundles above hearths, believed to keep fevers at bay. Elderberries, shriveled but potent, were boiled into syrups so tart that children winced but swallowed anyway, because everyone knew they worked. Willow bark, scraped and steeped, dulled pain before anyone knew the word aspirin. But remedies were only half the battle. Much depended on comfort, a mother's hand pressing a damp cloth to a hot forehead, a father rising in the night to keep the fire alive so the sick would not shiver, neighbors slipping bowls of broth to one another through doorways, even when they had little to spare. Illness turned the village into a web of quiet care, each household watching over the others. Superstition wove into healing, too. Some said a woolen scarf soaked in vinegar could draw sickness out of the chest. Others placed sprigs of rosemary or holly near bedsides to guard against the evil air. Whether or not these worked, they gave families something to believe in, a defense when medicine alone was not enough. Children were half afraid, half fascinated by the healer. They whispered that she could read the snow, that she spoke to the wind. Some swore she carried charms against spirits in her apron pocket. But when fever struck, mothers carried their little ones to her door without hesitation. She might not always save them, but her presence itself was medicine reassurance that they were not powerless. Death, of course, was never far. Winter claimed the frail first, the elderly whose lungs could not fight infection, the infants too weak to survive long nights. Funerals in winter were quiet, mourners gathering in the snowbound churchyard, their breaths rising in pale clouds as hymns trembled in the frozen air. Yet even here, ritual softened grief. Holly sprigs were laid on graves, evergreen against the white, a reminder that life persisted beyond the season, but for every life lost, many endured. And the stories of those recoveries, children who survived fevers, men who rose again after weeks of coughing, were carried into the next winter like talismans. They reminded the villagers that sickness, like snow, could be weathered, because survival wasn't just about food or fire. It was about care, the rough hands that stitched wounds, the whispered prayers over steaming cups, the faith that no one would face illness alone. That was the true medicine of the Victorian winter, community itself. Homes were more than shelter in Victorian villages. They were fortresses against the cold. A poorly kept cottage could mean sickness, hunger, even death. So every stone, every beam, every patch of straw mattered when winter closed in. Picture a row of cottages, their roofs white with snow, smoke curling faintly from chimneys. At first glance, they look quaint, almost picturesque. But inside, survival was a constant negotiation with drafts, damp, and biting cold. Most village homes were stone or timber framed, with thatched or slate roofs. Thatched roofs, though charming to us now, were far more practical than pretty. Layers of straw, tightly packed and bound, formed thick insulation. They shed rain in summer and held in warmth in winter, but only if they were cared for. Families patched the thatch before the first frost, climbing ladders to replace rotten spots with fresh bundles. If they didn't, snow and rain seeped through, dripping onto beds and spoiling food stores. Inside, windows were small, glass expensive. Many panes were warped or cracked, letting icy air slip through. Families stuffed rags or moss in the gaps. Some coated frames with clay or even smeared animal fat to block the draft. Curtains were thick, stitched from old blankets or patched wool, drawn tight before dusk to trap whatever heat the fire produced. Floors were often nothing more than packed earth. To keep them from freezing hard, villagers spread rushes, straw, or even old sacks. The smell of damp straw, mixed with smoke, cabbage, and tallow candles. It was the scent of winter survival. Wooden shutters rattled in the wind. Families hammered extra nails into their hinges, tied them shut with rope, or wedged them with sticks to keep the storm from tearing them open. The fireplace was the beating heart of the cottage. Everything revolved around it. Cooking, warmth, light, even social life. A fire never burned large because wood was precious, but it burned steady. Families banked embers at night, piling ashes on top so that by morning a faint glow could be coaxed back into flame. The hearth wasn't just for cooking stew, it was a lifeline, but smoke was its own enemy. Chimneys clogged with soot during winter, and without proper sweeping, smoke seeped back into rooms, stinging eyes, choking children, blackening walls. Some villagers could afford a sweep. Others sent their own sons up the flues, small boys scraping soot with rags, coughing but grateful for the few coins earned. Furniture became tools of survival too. Chairs and stools were pulled close to the fire. Beds were moved nearer to the hearth or stacked with every quilt, cloak, and sheepskin the household owned. Families often slept in the same room, not out of sentiment, but necessity. Body heat was as valuable as wood. Parents, children, even grandparents huddled together under the same heavy blankets. Privacy was sacrificed for warmth. Doors were another weak point. Thick planks kept out most wind, but gaps at the threshold let in frost. Villagers rolled cloths or stuffed sacks against the base, creating what we'd now call draft stoppers. Even so, a thin crust of ice sometimes formed on the inside latch by morning, glistening pale in the weak light of dawn. The fight against cold was relentless. But there was pride in it too. A well-kept cottage meant safety. Neighbors admired those whose fires smoked reliably, whose roofs shed snow without collapse. And if a family struggled, if illness or poverty left their home vulnerable, others often helped. Men patched roofs together. Women stitched curtains for neighbors. No one could afford to let a cottage fail, because one weak home was a risk to the whole village. If cottages were the shield, clothing was the armor. And in the Victorian countryside, the way people dressed in winter often meant the difference between enduring the season or falling to its bite. Now, forget any image of polished Victorian gentlemen in fine overcoats and silk scarves. That was London life, not the village lane. For ordinary men, women, and children in rural England or Scotland, winter clothing was about function first. Beauty was a distant second. Wool was the undisputed king of winter. Sheep provided more than meat and milk. They provided survival. Every family prized woolen garments, stockings, shawls, scarves, mittens, heavy skirts, and coats. These weren't light, airy fabrics. They were thick, scratchy, and sometimes heavy as a sack of potatoes when wet, but they trapped heat like nothing else. Families spent much of the autumn carding, spinning, and knitting wool, turning fleece into layers that would carry them through the coming freeze. Men layered breeches with thick wool stockings and tied them with garters. Over shirts, they wore waistcoats and heavy coats patched with whatever scraps were available. Many coats weren't elegant garments, but rough, pieced together layers stitched by wives or mothers. Long before sustainable fashion became a trend, villagers were already practicing it. A coat wasn't discarded when it tore. It was patched, restitched, and handed down until it could hold no more thread. Women bore the heaviest burden of winter dressing. They often wore multiple skirts, one over the other, to keep out the cold. Petticoats of wool or flannel sat beneath outer skirts of thicker cloth, and shawls were wrapped not once, but twice around shoulders. Mothers wrapped scarves around children's necks until only their eyes peeked through. Even then, the wind could cut straight through, leaving cheeks raw and red. Footwear was its own battlefield. Leather boots were costly, and many families could not afford proper pairs for every member. Boots were patched again and again with scraps of hide, cloth, or even nailed-on bits of wood. Children often wore hand-me-downs several sizes too large, their shoes stuffed with straw or rags to keep them from slipping off. The straw served as insulation too, though it needed to be replaced often, damp and frozen, by the end of a day's work. And then there were the makeshift additions. Old sacks became cloaks. Bits of sheepskin were tied around legs as makeshift gaiters. Gloves were scarce, so many relied on fingerless mitts that allowed for work while still offering some warmth. Women sometimes rubbed goose fat into children's hands and faces before sending them outside, a greasy layer against the biting air. Headwear was essential. Woolen caps, kerchiefs, or felt hats kept heat from escaping. Men often pulled caps low over their ears. Women tied kerchiefs tight under the chin. Children had knitted hoods, called comforters, that framed their faces in scratchy wool. Comforters weren't stylish, but they lived up to their name. They kept life bearable when frost clung to every branch. Laundry posed another problem. Clothes had to be washed, but winter water was icy, and garments took days to dry. Families often wore the same clothes for weeks at a stretch, mending them at night by firelight. The smell of smoke clung to wool, and sweat froze in fabric during outdoor work. It wasn't pleasant, but it was survival. Not all clothing came from sheep. Some families trapped rabbits or raised goats, using pelts as extra linings. Furs trimmed hoods, gloves, or cloaks, though only the wealthier villagers could afford full fur garments. Goose feathers were stuffed into quilts or stitched between layers of cloth for added warmth. Even scraps of horsehide or worn saddle leather were repurposed into clothing. And clothing wasn't just about warmth, it was also about work. Men needed to move, to swing axes, to haul wood in buckets of water. Too many layers could slow them down, so they learned to balance protection with mobility. Women faced the same challenge. Too little covering and frostbite threatened their fingers while scrubbing clothes or tending animals. Too much, and daily chores became impossible. Survival meant finding that balance every single day. One fascinating detail: clothing was deeply personal. A mother's shawl often carried the scent of hearth, smoke, and herbs, comforting children during long nights. A father's coat, patched by his wife's steady hand, bore the marks of years of winters endured. Each stitch was a story. Each tear and repair was proof of survival. So when we think about what Victorian villagers wore in their worst winters, don't imagine polished fashion plates. Imagine heavy skirts brushing snow in the lanes. Imagine children with straw-stuffed boots kicking through drifts. Imagine a man's shoulders bent beneath a patched coat that had seen 20 winters already. Their clothing was not about display, it was about defiance. Against hunger, against frost, against despair. And that defiance, woven into every thread, was what carried them through. Food in a Victorian village during a brutal winter was never about luxury. It was about survival. Every loaf of bread, every root dug from storage, every salted fish pulled from a barrel represented life stretched just a little further against the cold. Think about it. Winter wiped the fields bare. There were no fresh vegetables growing in neat rows, no fruit hanging heavy from the orchard. What you had in January or February was whatever you had managed to store, preserve, or trade before the frost set in. And if you didn't plan carefully, hunger would gnaw at your family long before the snow melted. Bread was the backbone of the diet. Flour came from wheat, barley, or oats, depending on the region, and it was often mixed with whatever else could be ground down to stretch it further. Acorns, dried peas, even sawdust-like husks sometimes found their way into loaves. This wasn't out of choice, it was necessity. A single loaf had to last, cut thinner and thinner as the weeks wore on. Mothers became masters of illusion, slicing bread in such a way that it looked more generous on the plate than it truly was. Soups and stews were the other lifeline. A pot simmered constantly on many hearths, filled with water, a few bones, perhaps a carrot or turnip, maybe some dried beans. The trick was to keep it going, to stretch it day after day, adding scraps as they became available. Leftover porridge from breakfast might be stirred in at noon. A sliver of meat, if there was any, could flavor broth for an entire family. The smell, thin as it was, became comfort itself. Preservation was everything. Families salted pork or beef in the fall, stacking cuts in barrels layered with coarse salt. Fish were cured the same way, or smoked until they were tough but long-lasting. Root vegetables, like potatoes, parsnips, and turnips, were buried in straw-lined cellars to keep them from freezing. Apples were wrapped in straw and stored carefully, each one checked through the winter for signs of rot. A shriveled apple in March was still a treasure, sweet and rare. Pickling was common too. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Onions, cucumbers, even eggs could be preserved in brine or vinegar. The sharp, tangy flavor wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a burst of vitality when fresh produce was months away. Some villagers swore by pickled foods to fend off winter fevers, though in truth it was the vitamins that kept scurvy at bay. And then there were the true last resorts. Families boiled bones until they dissolved into gelatin, scraping every trace of nourishment. Old bread was toasted, crumbled, and boiled into bread soup. Children were given thin porridge, flavored with a spoonful of treacle, if it could be spared, more to lift spirits than to fill bellies. Nothing was wasted. The skin of a pig, the fat from a joint, even potato peels, everything found its way into the pot. Meat, when it appeared, was precious beyond words. A rabbit snared in the hedgerow could feed a family for 2 days. A chicken slaughtered after it stopped laying eggs was roasted with reverence, every scrap saved for soups afterward. In villages with shared hunting rights, men sometimes pooled their luck. A deer brought down in the forest was shared widely, with strips smoked, salted, and divided among households. Even a handful of offal was welcome. The hunger month, February into March, was the cruelest. Stores dwindled, and every meal became thinner, weaker, more symbolic than sustaining. Parents went without so children could eat. Elders insisted they weren't hungry, when in truth, they were simply giving up their share. That quiet sacrifice was part of life. Everyone understood it, and no one spoke of it directly. But it wasn't just about the food itself. It was about the rituals around it. Families gathered close at mealtime, bowls in hand, steam rising in the dim light of the hearth. They gave thanks, even for a broth that was little more than hot water and herbs. Meals weren't about fullness, they were about connection. About reminding one another that, though their bellies ached, their spirits hadn't broken. And on rare occasions, there was celebration. A midwinter feast never lavish by noble standards, but precious for villagers. Everyone brought what little they could spare: a wheel of cheese, a loaf of bread, a rabbit, a jug of ale, a jar of pickled berries. Pooled together, it became a banquet. For one night, they laughed louder, sang longer, and ate more freely than the season allowed. It was a promise in the dark. Winter will not have the last word. So when we picture food in a Victorian village, it's not tables groaning under roasts and puddings. It's thin broth ladled carefully. It's bread sliced paper thin. It's a child clutching a shriveled apple as if it were gold. It's resourcefulness, patience, and sacrifice ingredients far more essential than flour, meat, or vegetables. Because food in those winters wasn't just sustenance, it was survival itself. Every Victorian cottage, no matter how small or poor, had one thing in common: a hearth. The fireplace was more than just a source of heat. It was the center of survival, the beating heart of the household, the place where warmth, food, and comfort all converged. Without it, a family simply could not endure a brutal winter. Picture a one-room stone cottage with a roof weighted by snow. Inside, the hearth burned low but steady. It was where meals simmered, where wet boots steamed, where children stretched their hands toward the flickering glow. The fire was the only line of defense against the cold that pressed in through walls, windows, and doors. And because of that, it was treated with a kind of reverence. Starting the fire each morning was a ritual. No matches, no lighters, just embers from the night before, carefully banked under ashes to keep them alive until dawn. A well-banked fire was a quiet triumph. If the embers had gone out, the day began with frustration. Parents would kneel, coaxing sparks from flint and steel, blowing patiently into kindling, praying the flame would catch. In winter, when hands were stiff and wood was damp, it could take hours. Imagine the dread of waking to a frozen hearth, the cottage as cold inside as the fields outside. Fuel was precious. Families used logs, peat, or even dried dung, depending on where they lived. Nothing was wasted. Broken furniture, old carts, even bundles of straw became kindling when supplies ran low. A large log might burn slowly through the night, but during the day, fires were kept small, just enough to keep frost from creeping across the walls. Every flame had to be measured, every ember stretched. The hearth was also the family's kitchen. Iron pots hung from hooks or rested on grates above the coals. Bread was baked on flat stones. Porridge thickened slowly, stirred with wooden spoons worn smooth from years of use. The smell of onions sizzling in fat or broth bubbling with root vegetables was the scent of life continuing. Food and fire were inseparable. Without the hearth, there was no meal. But beyond survival, the hearth carried meaning. It was the symbol of home. When storms raged and snow sealed the doors, families gathered close, their faces lit orange by firelight, shadows flickering against the low ceiling. Children whispered stories, elders told tales, mothers mended, fathers carved. The hearth's glow softened hardship, turning hunger and cold into moments of connection. It was also the keeper of memory. In many cottages, a shelf above the fireplace held small treasures: a Bible, a family keepsake, a candle stub saved for emergencies. Visitors who stepped inside a cottage would often be led straight to the hearth, offered the best seat by the fire, even if food or drink could not be spared. Hospitality began with warmth. Of course, the hearth carried risks. Chimneys clogged with soot could spark fires, especially in thatched roof cottages. Sparks flying from logs could set straw mats or clothes smoldering. Families were vigilant, banking fires carefully at night, using heavy stones or iron grates to contain them. Yet even with the danger, the hearth was too important to ever let go out. And then there was the light. Candles were precious and often saved for necessity. Lanterns helped, but the hearth gave a steady glow that pushed back the darkness. Imagine those long winter nights, with no electricity, no lamps humming in the corner, just firelight, shadows dancing across walls, crackling logs breaking the silence. For the Victorians, that was their entertainment, their comfort, their company. Children played games by the fire, casting shadows with their hands, singing songs, or rolling knucklebones across the floorboards. Lovers sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering beneath the hum of the flames. Old folks nodded in their chairs, their faces softened by the glow. The hearth didn't just warm bodies, it warmed spirits. In many ways, the hearth was a spiritual symbol too. Families prayed beside it, asking for health, food, and endurance. Villagers sometimes said that the fire carried voices of ancestors, that the crackle of the flames was a kind of wisdom whispering through the wood. Whether superstition or faith, one truth remained: as long as the fire burned, life endured. Hey guys, let's shift our gaze from the hearth to the very clothes on people's backs. Because for Victorian villagers, clothing wasn't just fashion, it was armor. When the wind howled through lanes and frost carved patterns across the windows, every stitch of wool, every scrap of leather, every layer sewn by calloused hands became the difference between shivering in misery and simply enduring. Forget about modern coats filled with down or jackets lined with synthetic insulation. Villagers had what the land and their own skill could provide. Wool was king. Sheep didn't just mean meat or milk. They meant survival in thread and cloth. Thick woolen garments, often scratchy but warm, were layered one over the other. Men wore heavy wool coats, women wrapped themselves in shawls, and children were swaddled in hand-me-downs, patched so many times they barely resembled their original form. Mothers and grandmothers were the quiet heroes of clothing. By the firelight, their needles clicked steadily through long winter nights, patching socks, knitting scarves, darning holes in mittens. Every scrap was used. Old coats were cut down into smaller jackets for children. Worn-out dresses became quilts. Even wool, unraveling from ruined garments, was washed, spun, and re-knit. Waste was not an option. Every fiber mattered. Footwear was a battle of its own. Boots, when a family could afford them, were sturdy leather, but constant exposure to snow and mud wore them down quickly. To extend their life, villagers stuffed them with straw for extra insulation. Sometimes children had to take turns wearing the best pair, when chores demanded going outside. For those with nothing better, rags were wrapped around feet and tied with string. A crude solution, but still better than frostbite. Gloves were another story. Many families couldn't spare wool for each child's hands, so mittens were shared or swapped. A common trick was to tuck hands into armpits while walking outside, or to hold warm stones fresh from the hearth. When livestock needed tending, bare hands often froze against buckets and tools, cracking the skin until it bled. Salves made from animal fat were smeared on wounds, but prevention came first, layers upon layers, even if they weren't pretty. The poor wore clothes that were more patchwork than garment, stitched from whatever could be scavenged. But even the wealthier villagers weren't immune to winter's bite. Finer wool and imported fabrics helped, but no cloth could banish cold entirely. Everyone, from the farmer in the fields to the vicar in his pulpit, learned the art of layering. Undergarments, shirts, waistcoats, coats, cloaks, all stacked together like armor plates. Scarves and shawls carried special meaning. They weren't just warmth. They were a mother's love wrapped around a child's neck, a grandmother's labor woven into threads. In many villages, shawls became heirlooms, passed down across generations, carrying not just wool, but memory. To wear one was to carry family history close against the cold. Even fashion itself bent to winter's will. Women's skirts, usually burdensome in summer, added insulation in winter when layered with petticoats. Men's top hats gave way to wool caps or fur-lined hats. And cloaks, thick, sweeping, and heavy, were as much a symbol of practicality as they were of status. But clothing wasn't only protection from the cold. It was survival strategy. Wet garments were deadly, so families worked hard to dry them near the hearth, hanging them from beams or laying them across chairs. The smell of damp wool steaming in firelight was as much a part of winter as smoke or broth. Shoes were set near embers, turned carefully to keep them from hardening like boards. There was also pride in resilience. Neighbors might nod in respect at a well-patched coat, recognizing the effort behind every stitch. Children showed off mittens knitted in bright colors, even if the yarn was mismatched. In those moments, clothing wasn't just about enduring, it was about dignity. Even in hunger and hardship, people found ways to carry themselves with quiet pride. And then there was Sunday best. No matter how bleak the winter, families saved their neatest clothes for church. Walking through knee-deep snow, cloaks drawn tight, and boots cracking on the frozen ground, villagers looked almost regal in their determination. They knew their coats were thin, their mittens worn, but to show up in dignity was a kind of defiance against the season. When the snow came down so heavy that doors barely opened and the wind roared through chimneys like a living thing, Victorian villagers quickly learned a truth as sharp as the frost. No one survived winter alone. Hey guys, Today, let's talk about the heart of endurance in those brutal months community. Imagine narrow lanes buried under drifts taller than a man. The path to the barn gone, the way to the neighbor's cottage swallowed whole. In moments like that, survival became a collective act. Men grabbed their shovels, their shoulders hunched against the gale, and carved tunnels through the snow. They weren't digging just for themselves, they were linking one household to another, stitching the village back together. A narrow path cleared meant a child could reach the healer, or a bucket of milk could be carried to a sick elder. It wasn't glamorous work. Hands blistered, backs ached, and frost stung every bit of exposed skin. But neighbors leaned on each other. One man dug until his arms shook, then another stepped in, and then another. The rhythm of shovels against ice became the music of survival. Without those pathways, cottages became prisons. With them, the village breathed again. Sharing went beyond snow shovels. Food scarce, precious, often rationed to the last crumb, was pooled when needed most. If one family's cow went dry, another poured a little milk into a clay jug and left it quietly on the doorstep. If one household still had a sack of beans, they might trade it for firewood or simply gift it outright, knowing that tomorrow they might be the ones in need. This wasn't charity. It was mutual insurance, a silent pact that no one would be left to starve alone. Think of how powerful that island, a loaf of bread sliced thinner so it could stretch to the cottage next door, a pot of broth carried through the snow, its steam rising in the freezing air like a promise of kindness. Children were often the messengers, their small hands clutching bundles wrapped in cloth, running between houses with food or news. Even they understood that survival was not a solitary endeavor. It was a web of giving and receiving, unspoken but binding. Firewood was another lifeline that tied people together. A man who had cut more than his family shared a few logs with a widow who couldn't swing an axe anymore. Boys gathered kindling for the elderly, piling it high by their doors without waiting to be asked. And when storms grew so fierce that roofs sagged under the weight, groups of men clambered onto ladders side by side, hacking and shoving snow free before the timbers could splinter. It was dangerous work, but done together, it carried less fear. And let's not forget the small, quiet gestures that made all the difference. A lantern hung outside the church, glowing faintly through the storm, told villagers that others were still awake, still keeping watch. Knocks on doors at midnight, when the wind howled loudest, were neighbors checking that the sick were still breathing, that fires were still burning. Even just the sound of footsteps crunching past a cottage gave reassurance someone else was out there, enduring too. The church itself often became the hub of community strength, not only a place of worship. It was a gathering point for distributing food, for shelter when a roof gave way, for comfort when illness struck. The bells didn't just mark Sunday service, they called for help, warned of danger, or signaled that all was well. To hear the bell ringing across the snowy fields was to be reminded you were not forgotten. Children absorbed these lessons early. They saw their parents set aside pride and ask for flour, or lend a loaf when they could barely spare it. They heard their mothers whisper thanks over borrowed candles, saw their fathers clasp hands with neighbors after a long night of digging snow. Community wasn't just a convenience, it was survival, written into every act, every exchange, every shared burden. And in the telling of winter's stories, long after the frost had melted, It was always these acts of solidarity that shone brightest. Not the hunger, not the cold, but the memory of a neighbor arriving with firewood at dusk, or a stranger's hand steadying you on an icy path. These were the things that kept despair at bay. So yes, Victorian winters were cruel. They starved bodies, they froze hands, they tested wills. But they also revealed something deeper, that survival was not about the strongest standing alone, but about many standing together. Shoulder to shoulder, shoveling paths, sharing loaves, carrying lanterns through the dark. That was the true warmth of winter, the fire no frost could extinguish. We've talked about faith, food, fire, and the endless labor that kept Victorian villagers alive in the harshest winters. But today, let's turn to something often overlooked, the role of children. Because in a world of scarcity and storm, it was often the smallest voices, the giggles in the snow and the whispers by candlelight, that reminded everyone life was still worth fighting for. Think of a January evening, when the sky outside is an iron sheet, wind rattling every shutter, frost crawling across the glass. Inside the cottage, the fire struggles, and the stew bubbling in the pot is little more than flavored water. Adults sit silent, weighed down by hunger and worry. And then suddenly laughter erupts. Two children invent a game with shadows on the wall, turning their hands into dancing birds and wolves. The sound cuts through despair like a spark in the dark. For a moment, the heaviness eases, and weary parents smile. That's how important children were. Their play was not frivolous, it was medicine. Even in hunger, their imagination stitched joy from scraps. A broken spoon became a knight's sword. A bit of wool stuffed into cloth became a doll. The bottom of a barrel became a drum, beaten with sticks, until the room shook with rhythm. These makeshift toys, humble as they were, gave children a world beyond frostbitten fingers and growling stomachs. And the adults, they quietly cherished it. They saw that laughter not only warmed the room, but also lifted the entire family's will to endure. A child's giggle carried more strength than any sermon. It said, "We can still find joy here. We can still be alive, even in the dead of winter." Outside, when storms calmed, children claimed the snow as their own. They rolled lopsided snowmen with pebble eyes and carrot noses stolen from dwindling stores. They dug forts and flung snowballs until their hands stung. They skated clumsily on frozen ponds, strapping wood to their boots when no skates existed, tumbling with arms flailing, and getting back up with unstoppable delight. Parents fretted, yes, worried about frostbite and broken bones, but most let the play continue, knowing it was better to have children embrace the cold with laughter than shrink from it with fear. Indoors, games were quieter. Knucklebones carved from sheep bones clicked on the floorboards. Dog-eared decks of cards passed between hands, their soft slap punctuating whispers and giggles. Even the smallest scraps became tools for storytelling. Imagine a child holding a candle stub, casting strange silhouettes on the plaster walls, weaving tales of monsters, heroes, and kingdoms beneath the snow. In a winter where days blurred together, these sparks of imagination carved pockets of joy. But here's the deeper truth. Children were more than entertainment. They were living reminders of the future. Every loaf divided, every log burned, every prayer whispered at its core. It was done to protect them. The sight of rosy cheeks, even when thin from hunger, fueled the adults to keep shoveling, snow from roofs, to keep breaking ice on troughs, to keep walking through drifts with firewood strapped to their backs. Mothers sacrificed their portions so children might eat. Fathers handed over the last apple, feigning fullness. Grandparents told stories, not for themselves, but to give little ones courage. In this way, children were both the heaviest burden and the brightest light. Their survival meant the survival of the community's spirit. And let's not forget the lessons winter pressed into young hearts. They learned resilience early, how to carry water from frozen wells, how to gather kindling with hands gone red and raw, how to patch stockings or tend animals when parents were too weary. Hunger and cold carved them into stronger souls than most could imagine today. Yet within that hardship, they still managed to hold on to wonder. Do you see the paradox? Children bore the weight of winter like everyone else, yet they also resisted it with play, laughter, and imagination. They reminded their elders that life wasn't only about endurance, it was about joy, however fleeting. And in the darkest months, joy was as necessary as bread. Last time we talked about children, their laughter, their games, the way their joy kept spirits alive even when hunger gnawed and the wind howled. But survival in a Victorian village wasn't carried only on the small shoulders of children. It also rested on the bent backs and steady voices of the elders, those who had seen more winters than most dared to count. Picture the hearth on a night when the wind screams through the lanes and snow buries doors up to their lintels. Families huddled close, quilts wrapped tight, stew pots simmering with little more than broth and roots. And near the fire, always, sits the oldest soul in the house. Their hands are twisted with age, their breath shallow, but their eyes glow with the kind of strength no storm can take away. They had seen winters like this before and worse. For the young, the elders were teachers. They spoke in low voices, telling of years when snow buried cottages to the roof, when wolves circled the village edges, when hunger drove men to grind acorns into bread. They did not tell these tales to frighten, but to steady, to remind everyone that hardship was not new, that endurance was in their blood. Each story was a torch, passed from one generation to the next. Imagine a grandfather leaning on his stick, his voice cracking as he recalls a winter so cold that rivers froze solid, and wagons crossed them as if they were stone roads. Or a grandmother speaking of famine years when neighbors shared their last loaf, keeping one another alive through sheer generosity. These were not fairy tales. They were living memory, a ledger of survival written in flesh and frost. And it wasn't only about stories. Elders carried wisdom of the land. They knew which herbs could ease a fever, how to tell if frostbite had set in, how to mend boots with scraps of leather, how to stretch broth until it fed 6 instead of 3. They knew when the sun lingered longer on the horizon, it meant thaw was near. And when a certain bird sang in the hedges, it was a sign spring had returned. Their knowledge was not written down, it was lived, and it was vital. But winter was cruelest to them. Frail bodies felt the cold more deeply. Brittle joints ached longer. Coughs lingered heavier. Many families worried most for their grandparents, knowing the season pressed hardest on those who had the least strength left. And yet, despite their weakness, elders gave strength to others. Their presence was a kind of anchor, saying with every breath, "I have endured before. We will endure again." There's something powerful about that image, an old woman's hand resting on her granddaughter's shoulder, trembling but steady, passing comfort without words. Or an old man standing by the window, looking out at the frozen fields, his silence reminding everyone that seasons turn, storms end, and life always finds its way back. In many ways, the elders were the village's memory keepers. Without them, the community risked forgetting how many winters had already been survived. With them, every hardship became part of a larger story, not an isolated disaster. And that perspective, that sense of continuity, was as important as bread or wood. Yet let's be honest, not every moment was solemn. Elders also brought humor. They chuckled at children's antics, teased younger men about their clumsy shoveling, and laughed at the small absurdities of life. Humor was their rebellion against despair. When an old man joked that his joints creaked louder than the rafters in a storm, everyone laughed. And in that laughter, the cold seemed less sharp. And when loss came, and it always did in winter, it was the elders who helped frame it. They reminded the living that every life was part of a chain, and that even death could not sever the bond of community. Funerals were hushed affairs in the snow, but when the vicar's voice faded, it was often the elders' words that carried meaning. We have buried before, and we have endured. We will endure again. Think of what that meant for the young. To see not fear, but calm acceptance. To see not despair, but quiet gratitude. For each day survived. In that example lay the deepest lesson of all. So when we ask, how did Victorian villagers survive their worst winters? The answer is not just firewood, broth, livestock, or blankets. It is also the elders. Their stories were as nourishing as food. Their wisdom was as protective as wool. Their presence was as steady as the church bell ringing through the snow. In their wrinkles was the memory of countless winters. In their voices was proof that survival was possible. And in their endurance was the greatest gift they could give, the assurance that no matter how fierce the cold, life would always rise again. Last time, we spent time with the elders, their voices, their memories, their wisdom that helped the young endure. But winter in Victorian villages also brought loss, and with loss came ritual. If the hearth was where life gathered, the churchyard was where the community confronted its fragility. And in those frozen months, the churchyard told its own story of survival. Imagine the far edge of the village, where fields give way to a low stone wall. Beyond it lies the churchyard, a quiet place where wooden crosses lean under the weight of snow, where crooked stones rise like teeth from the earth, softened by drifts of white. In winter, it was not a place of frequent visits. The journey itself was hard, and the cold unforgiving, but it was never forgotten. When illness claimed a villager, or when age finally overcame frail bones, the bell tolled through the snow. Its sound was heavy, solemn, carrying across rooftops and frozen fields. People paused in their work, men resting their axes, women lifting their heads from the hearth, children silenced mid-laugh. Everyone knew what that toll meant. Another flame had gone out. Funerals in winter were different from those in summer. There were no lush green meadows or warm breezes. Instead, there was the sharp bite of air, breaths rising in pale clouds, hands clasped in woolen gloves. The vicar's voice carried low, half muffled by the wind, yet every word seemed to weigh more heavily against the silence of snow. Hymns were sung softly, their notes trembling in the frozen air, sometimes breaking as cold lungs struggled to push the sound forth. The hardest task was always the grave itself. Men dug with slow, steady strokes, their shovels clanging against earth hard as stone. It could take hours, sometimes days, to carve out enough depth to lay a coffin to rest. Their work was exhausting, their bodies soaked in sweat despite the cold, steam rising from their backs as they labored. But it was done with reverence. In their eyes, every villager deserved rest in consecrated ground, no matter the season. And then, in the hush that followed, the coffin was lowered, the snow brushing its sides as though the season itself claimed witness. For a moment, the village felt its fragility keenly, each life like a candle flickering in the wind. But in that very fragility lay strength. To gather, to honor, to remember, it bound the people closer than the storm could ever tear apart. Yet the churchyard was not only sorrow, it was also remembrance. Families paused at old graves, brushing snow gently from stones, leaving sprigs of holly or evergreen as symbols of life persisting even in the harshest season. Children, too young to understand fully, still felt the solemn air, their little footprints weaving among the larger ones. They might not have known the names on the stones, but they sensed the importance of being there. At night, under a pale moon, the churchyard seemed almost otherworldly. The stones gleamed faintly, their shadows stretching across the drifts. The silence was so deep it felt as though time itself had stopped. Haunting, yes, but also comforting. For the villagers, it was proof they were part of something larger, a chain of endurance that stretched beyond one winter, beyond one lifetime. This is what made the churchyard essential to survival. It reminded the living that, while winter could take, it could never erase memory, that though snow could bury doors, and frost could silence fields, love and remembrance could not be smothered. And that knowledge gave the living reason to endure. Think about it. Without places like the churchyard, survival might have felt meaningless. But with it, every sacrifice, every hardship, every act of endurance became part of a story that stretched before and after them. Children grew up knowing they belonged to something older than themselves. Adults carried their burdens knowing they carried them for more than just the present moment. And elders found peace knowing their lives too would be remembered when the snow fell again. So when we talk about how Victorian villagers survived their worst winters, we can't stop at food, fire, or shelter. We must also speak of remembrance, because to survive the season was not just to endure, it was to carry forward the memory of those who hadn't. That act of remembrance gave meaning to survival, turning bare existence into something sacred. Last time, we stood quietly in the snow-covered churchyard, where memory and love held the villagers together through loss. But even as grief weighed heavy, life never stopped moving. And in time, winter itself began to shift. It never surrendered all at once. It clung fiercely, bitterly, testing every ounce of endurance. Yet one morning, after weeks of silence, something extraordinary happened. A bird sang. It wasn't much, just a faint, hesitant note in the pale air. But after so many months of quiet, broken only by wind and labor, it startled the villagers. Children were the first to notice, pressing their noses against frosted glass, eyes wide with wonder. Soon more followed. Robins appeared, their red breasts flashing like embers against the snow. Sparrows chattered in quick bursts, hopping boldly across frozen lanes. Even the crows grew bolder, circling above with harsh, confident cries. For the villagers, These sounds were more than noise. They were signs, whispers of spring carried on wings. Mothers smiled softly, pointing them out to little ones, saying, "The earth is waking." Some families scattered crumbs near their doorways, not out of luxury, but gratitude. To feed the birds was to feed hope itself, to honor the fragile thread of life that tied the village to the wider world. Soon after came the sound of dripping. At first faint, almost easy to dismiss, like water spilled from a bucket, but it grew insistent. Drip, drip, drip. Icicles wept in the midday sun. Rivulets traced silver lines down stone walls, and little channels carved themselves through the snow. Children cupped their hands under eaves, catching the icy water, giggling as it sparkled in the light. Farmers stood still in their doorways, watching, listening, their faces slack with relief. Meltwater meant the sun was gaining strength, that the frozen grip was loosening. Buckets were set beneath dripping roofs, soon filling with sharp, clean water. After months of melting snow or drawing from icy wells, the taste was like liquid purity, fresh, sweet, alive. Some swore it carried the flavor of spring itself, as though hope had been distilled into every drop. Even elders, worn by many winters, closed their eyes and let the sound of dripping soothe them. For they knew it marked the turning of time. And yet the Thor, as villagers called the thaw, was never steady. Nights still froze, hard and merciless, sealing rivulets back into ribbons of glass. Some mornings the world seemed cruelly unchanged, white and brittle as before. People called these moments false springs, teases, promises snatched away. Disappointment weighed heavily, especially when food was low and bodies weak. But even false springs held meaning. They taught patience, caution, resilience. The land responded slowly. Snow retreated in hesitant patches, first at the base of cottages, then along south-facing slopes, until dark soil showed through like ink stains on white parchment. Children crouched near these patches, fingers digging in the damp earth, whispering to one another as though coaxing it to wake. And then, one morning, a cry of joy rang out. A child had found a snowdrop. It was small, fragile, trembling in the cold breeze, but to the villagers it was a miracle. Soon, more appeared, clustered along hedgerows and fence posts. Pale blossoms bowed against the weight of frost, yet still they rose, fearless, against the snow. Elders called them hope flowers, saying they had bloomed in every generation no matter how harsh the winter. Some claimed they were planted by unseen hands, a divine reminder that endurance was never wasted. Others whispered they were the earth's way of speaking, "I have not forgotten you. I will rise again." The animals sensed the change as well. Horses stamped more eagerly in their stalls, nostrils flaring at the warmer air. Sheep pressed against barn doors, bleating impatiently for fields still buried under snow. Dogs bounded through the lanes, tails high, energized by scents carried on the breeze. Even the wild creatures seemed to celebrate. Foxes skulked boldly at the edges of thawing woods, and birds darted low over the river as cracks opened in the ice, flashing silver water below. And oh, the river! For months it had been silent under armor of ice, but now faint groans echoed from its surface. At first it sounded like distant thunder, unsettling and strange. Then fissures spread like veins across the white shell, great slabs cracked, shifting and colliding with hollow booms, carried downstream by the rushing current. Children cheered from the banks, pointing at the dark water gleaming for the first time in months. Farmers knelt at the edge, dipping hands into the icy flow, letting it run across their skin as though reacquainting themselves with an old friend. But the thaw brought danger too. Currents ran strong, swollen by melting snow from the hills. Bridges strained, timbers groaning as rushing ice slammed against them. Parents warned children sternly to keep back, knowing too well the river's treachery. Yet fear could not outweigh relief. To hear water again, to smell its clean sharpness in the air, was to believe fully that life was returning. Clothes appeared on lines again, no longer freezing stiff but fluttering lazily in the breeze. Windows cracked open to let in fresh air, sweeping away the heavy scent of smoke that had lingered for months. Children ran without their heaviest cloaks, faces flushed from exhilaration rather than cold. Their laughter carried through the lanes, bright, unrestrained, like music the whole village had been waiting to hear. And slowly, almost shyly, color crept back into the world. Moss gleamed green on stone walls. Catkins dangled yellow from hazel branches. Daffodils nodded shyly in corners where the sun lingered longest, against the memory of endless white. Each color seemed brighter, sharper, almost unreal in its beauty. Women wove garlands of greenery, hanging them on doors as if to declare victory. Elders pointed out each bloom to children, teaching them what each sign meant. Hawthorn buds for warmer days, daffodils for loosened soil, blossoms for planting soon. The air itself shifted. No longer metallic with snow, it carried the sweetness of thawing earth. Sometimes, if the wind turned right, villagers swore they could smell grass waiting beneath the soil. They inhaled deeply, filling lungs with promise, their bodies lightened by the scent. Yet perhaps the greatest change was not in the land, but in the people. Faces that had been thin and gray now carried faint color. Voices grew stronger. Laughter came more easily. Songs rose louder in the church. Hope, once whispered, was now spoken boldly, carried in conversations at the well, in greetings across thawing lanes, in stories told at the inn. The thaw did not erase hardship. Bellies still ached, stores were still low, and nights still froze. But it gave something just as vital as food or fire: certainty. The certainty that winter, however cruel, was not endless. That endurance was not for nothing. That spring, though late, would always come. Hey guys, last time we listened to the first whispers of spring, the dripping of meltwater, the birds returning, and the river groaning awake under its broken armor of ice. But the true proof that the season was turning came not from the fields or sky, but from the barns. After months of stillness, the barns began to stir with sound. First came the high, fragile bleats of lambs. Borne onto the straw in the dead of night, their tiny bodies trembled against the chill, steam rising faintly from their wool as lantern light flickered across damp coats. Farmers, weary but alert, knelt in the straw, guiding these small lives into the world with hands both rough and gentle. Mothers wrapped the newborns in scraps of cloth, rubbing them briskly until their legs grew strong enough to stand. Children crowded the stalls, eyes wide, marveling as the lambs wobbled clumsily toward their mother's milk. Each birth was celebrated quietly, but deeply. Every lamb meant wool for spinning, warmth for the cold seasons ahead, and eventually food to sustain the family. Soon calves followed, their long legs folding awkwardly as they stumbled through straw, eyes wide and dark, reflecting the glow of lanterns. Their mothers lowed softly, licking them clean, while farmers spread fresh hay beneath them. The barns, once silent and heavy with the smell of old hay and damp wood, became filled with the sounds of life, the rustle of straw, the gentle murmur of animals, the impatient bleating of hungry mouths. These sounds were more than background noise. They were a chorus of survival, a rhythm that reassured the villagers. The earth was returning to its cycle, and so were they. For children, it was a wonder. Every new creature was a miracle to touch, to name, to marvel at. For elders, it was comfort. They had seen countless winters, countless thaws, and these births were proof that endurance was never wasted. But the work was heavy. Farmers rose at all hours to tend the animals. Fires were sometimes lit in the barns themselves, smoke curling into rafters to push back the cold, so no newborn would freeze before its first breath of life. Each small victory mattered. Every lamb that survived was another stitch of hope woven into the fabric of the village. Every calf that stood was a promise that the fields, once thawed, would be plowed again. The barn was a sanctuary of resilience, and outside, the land began to echo that renewal. The river, once locked in silence, now roared with new strength, swollen with meltwater rushing from the hills. Sheets of ice cracked and floated downstream, colliding with thunderous groans. Farmers dipped buckets into its flow, tasting water sharp and clean, laughing softly as though reacquainting themselves with life itself. But they were cautious too. The current was strong, the banks slick, and parents warned children to keep their distance. The river was beautiful, yes, but it was also a reminder that nature never gave without demanding respect. Then came the first warm breezes, soft, almost hesitant, carrying not the sting of frost but the faintest caress of life. Villagers paused in their chores, tilting their faces upward, closing their eyes as if to drink in the air. The breeze carried scents they had almost forgotten, the musk of damp soil, the sweetness of thawing grass, the promise of green waiting just beneath the surface. Even the animals responded. Horses tossed their heads, stamping impatiently. Sheep pressed closer to barn doors, eager to graze. Dogs barked joyfully, bounding through thawing lanes. And then, slowly, color crept back. At first, it was just moss, glowing against stone walls. Then catkins, pale yellow, dangling delicately from branches. Finally, snowdrops and violets appeared in clusters, startlingly vivid against the melting snow. Children ran barefoot through muddy patches, clutching handfuls of blossoms, presenting them proudly to mothers who placed them in jars on windowsills where they glowed like little suns. The thaw turned the land into both promise and trial. Snowmelt flooded fields, soaking furrows into ponds of mud. Every step threatened to pull a boot clean off. Carts bogged down, wheels sinking deep into sodden ground. Ditches had to be cleared, trenches dug, water redirected before planting could even be considered. But even this hard labor carried hope, because where there was mud, there was life. Where the soil was wet, it was ready to awaken. Elders, leaning on sticks, stood at the edges of fields, watching as farmers bent low to test the earth between their fingers. Though thin and weary, the people smiled. They knew the land would respond, as it always had, giving generously in return for patience and labor. And so, day by day, step by step, the village shifted from endurance to renewal. The snow still clung in corners, the nights still bit with frost, and hunger had not yet vanished. But with lambs bleating in barns, rivers running free, and green shoots daring to pierce the thawing soil, the people carried something stronger than full bellies or warm fires. They carried certainty. Certainty that winter had lost its hold. Certainty that life had returned. Certainty that their endurance had not been in vain. Last time we saw how life returned to the barns and rivers, the lambs born in straw, the calves wobbling on new legs, and the first warm breezes carrying scents of thawing soil. But for a Victorian village, the real turning point of survival came with the act of sowing. When the ground softened enough to accept seed, it wasn't just farming, it was faith in action. The fields had lain buried under snow for months, silent and heavy, but now dark furrows opened under the press of wooden plows. Horses, lean from a long winter but driven by instinct, strained against their harnesses. Their hooves struck rhythm into the thawed earth, while men guided the plows carefully, feeling the soil's resistance give way to readiness. The smell that rose from those furrows was unmistakable, rich, earthy, alive. To farmers who had spent months breathing only smoke and frost, it was almost intoxicating. Seeds were guarded like treasure. Every sack had been counted and recounted through the hungry months, and now, with hands steady but reverent, the villagers scattered them into the soil. Barley, oats, rye staples that meant bread on the table and survival through the next winter. Each handful tossed was more than grain. It was a promise, a whispered prayer carried on the breeze. Mothers followed the men with baskets, replenishing palms worn rough from years of labor. Children, laughing and wide-eyed, tossed small fists of seed, their innocence turning work into play. Even the elders shuffled forward, stooping low to drop kernels from trembling fingers, unwilling to be left out of the ritual that bound generations together. Overhead, birds circled, bold in their hunger, swooping to snatch stray seeds. Children shouted and waved sticks, chasing them off, though laughter often spilled as dogs joined in, barking wildly. Still, some grain was lost to wings and beaks, but the villagers took it in stride. "Let them have their share," one elder muttered. "Even hunger teaches generosity." The act of sowing was exhausting. Mud clung heavy to boots, every step a battle. Plows creaked, ropes frayed, and backs bent under strain. Yet no one complained, because for the first time in months, their labor wasn't just about endurance, it was about building toward plenty. They worked with smiles, with songs, even with laughter that had been rare through the long dark. At the edge of the fields, women gathered herbs that had survived the frost, drying them for medicines and teas. Children ran barefoot through soft mud, their laughter mixing with the lowing of cattle turned out to pasture again. Dogs chased flocks of birds, while elders sat on stones, watching, remembering other springs, other sowings, other triumphs over long winters past. When the day ended, and the last seed was sown, the people stood together in the fading light, gazing over the freshly turned earth. The furrows stretched like lines of hope across the land. There was no feast waiting, no sudden abundance, but there was something even more powerful. The sight of the future, buried in soil, waiting to rise. That evening, the village gathered in the square, not to celebrate with food stores were still meager, but to share stories, music, and companionship. Fiddles played, pipes sang, and voices lifted into the cool air. Children clapped, couples danced awkwardly on cobblestones, and elders nodded along, their eyes reflecting firelight. For once, laughter outshone hunger, and hope outweighed fear. In cottages that night, fires burned bright, not just for warmth, but for joy. Families prayed quietly over their hearths, asking that the seeds would take, that the earth would be generous, that next winter would be kinder. Children drifted to sleep with muddy feet and rosy cheeks, dreaming not of hunger but of green fields and golden harvests. And so, the cycle turned. From frost and silence to mud and seed, from endurance to renewal, the villagers knew hardship would return, as it always did. But for now, in the dark furrows stretching across the fields, they had written their defiance against the cold, their belief in tomorrow, their unshakable will to live. Hey guys, we've traveled together through the frost-bitten lanes, the silent barns, the hungry months, and finally into the light of spring. We've seen how Victorian villagers endured storms that buried doors, hunger that hollowed cheeks, and nights that felt endless. And yet, every time, they rose again. They turned scraps into meals, fear into prayer, silence into song. They didn't just survive winter, they carved meaning from it. By summer, the fields rippled green and gold. Children ran barefoot in grass that only weeks before had been buried in snow. Markets brimmed again with food. Music, laughter, and color returned to the square. But the memory of winter remained, not as dread, but as a teacher. The first lesson was patience. Winter moved at its own pace, and the people learned to wait, to measure time not in hours but in nights, endured, fires kept alive, candles saved for darkest evenings. The second was resourcefulness. They discovered how much could be done with little, how scraps stitched together could warm, how broth made thin could still comfort. The third was compassion. Neighbors shared what little they had, carrying food across drifts, leaving firewood at doors. Those small acts became the true lifelines of the village. And, above all, they carried gratitude. Every egg gathered, every sprout rising, every sunrise without snow became a gift. That gratitude made their joy deeper, their laughter louder, their bonds unbreakable. Winter had tried to silence them. Instead, it taught them to cherish life more fiercely. Tonight, as we end this journey together, I hope their story reminds you of something simple but powerful. That hardship doesn't erase hope, it sharpens it. That even in the coldest season, warmth can be found in the hands of those around you. And that every winter, no matter how long, always carries within it the promise of spring. So thank you for walking these snowy lanes with me. Close your eyes now, breathe deep, and let the memory of endurance carry you into rest. May you feel the quiet strength of those who came before us, and may your dreams tonight be warm, peaceful, and full of light. Good night, my friends. Sleep well.